Hi, I'm Father Joseph Mary, and welcome back to A Simple Word, where we reflect on the gospel for the coming Sunday. This Sunday's gospel asks the question, what's in a name? The parable tells the story of the rich man and Lazarus and their eventual eternal fates. And as always, the intended audience of this story is crucial. Luke begins with, Jesus said to the Pharisees. This parable is intended specifically for the religious leaders. So let's begin by looking at the first part of the parable. Luke introduces us to the two key characters in this story, and their circumstances couldn't possibly be more contrasting. First, Luke tells us there was a rich man who dressed in purple garments and fine linen, and dined sumptuously each day. Now, first off, and most striking, this rich man has no name. The tradition refers to him simply as dives, the Latin translation for rich. He's a man without an identity. Now, this rich man lived in extreme luxury and an almost arrogant opulence. He was clothed in the finest of purple linens. Who else wore fine robes of purple linen? The Jewish high priest. Remember to whom Jesus is addressing the parable. This purple linen was so expensive, it would have cost a working man nearly 2 months' wages to purchase. The purple dye was obtained from the neck vein of a rare Mediterranean fish, and the fine linen worn underneath was produced from the flax that grew on the banks of the Nile River in Egypt. This was an extremely wealthy man. But there's something deeper here. The Greek word porphron, which we translate as purple, is also translated as scarlet. Remember the words of Isaiah, though your sins be as scarlet. This is a man wrapped in wealth and yet saturated in sin. This rich man, dives, feasted in luxury every day of his life. And again, the Greek's more descriptive. The term feasted is euphronomenos, which is the word used for costly dining on exotic dishes. In Palestine in the time of Jesus, common people were fortunate if they could afford to eat meat even once a week. And yet this rich man gorges himself on exotic meats every day. Luke then introduces us to a character whose circumstances couldn't be a more polar opposite. Lying at the door of this rich man was a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who would gladly have eaten his fill of the scraps that fell from the rich man's table. The introduction of Lazarus is strikingly different than the introduction of the rich man. Lazarus is the Latin translation of the Hebrew Eleazar, which means literally, God is my help. This is a real man, an individual with a proper name. And what is Lazarus doing? He's sitting at the door of dives. In an era of Palestine in which knives, forks, and napkins didn't exist, people ate their food with their hands. And if you were very wealthy, you wiped your hands with chunks of bread and tossed them away. That's why the dogs are here. They're fighting Lazarus for the discarded crumbs. Lazarus is a sick man, covered in open, ulcerated wounds. Lazarus is a man of wretched poverty, a beggar battling wild animals for a few crumbs. His place in this world couldn't possibly be more different than dives. And then quite suddenly Luke shifts focus, and he tells us that both men died. The soul of Lazarus was accompanied by angels, while the soul of the rich man was brought to torment. What was the sin of dives? He didn't mock or abuse Lazarus. He wasn't intentionally cruel or callous. He didn't complain when Lazarus consumed his discarded crumbs. The sin of dives was that he never even saw Lazarus, never noticed him, never even occurred to him to help Lazarus, to alleviate his suffering. Dives was a man who could behold bitter suffering, and yet there was no answering cry of pity in his heart. There's a terrifying warning here. We may have the power to change the world, but the world has the power to change us. This rich man became so consumed by his wealth, his power, his pleasure, his prestige, that he became blind to everything else. Blind to such simple things as mercy, compassion, suffering. Something about dives became inhuman. That's why he has no name. But Lazarus, despite all his suffering, his sickness, his dire circumstances, Lazarus was a man who clung to God, who trusted in God, who loved God, who looked for everything, even the smallest crumbs, to God. What about us? Because Jesus told this parable to the Pharisees, but this gospel is addressed to our lives. Could we truly say with St. Francis of Assisi that God is my everything? When we look on the plight of the suffering all around us, the homeless on the streets, the beggar on the corner, the bullied kid in your classroom, the slandered coworker at the next desk, does it pierce our hearts with pity and compassion? Do we respond with mercy? Or are we just as blind as Dives? Just as blind as he was to Lazarus? That reveals the condition of our hearts. It tells us the truth about ourselves. Have we lost something of our humanity by striving after the things of this world? Or are we Eleazar, he who clings to God? Because at the end of our life, we're all going to knock on that door. To some of us, like Dives, he's going to say, I never knew you. I don't know your name. And to some, he's going to say, you are the one who clung to me. Thanks for listening to A Simple Word. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you again next week.